I know we are very short of time. On one hand, I want to believe that yes, we will go back to pre-pandemic in terms of getting back the hour worked that have been lost during the crisis. On the other hand, I don't think that we will ever go back in terms of the way we organize the industrial relation, the way we organize our work-life balance, and so forth. And you did mention a point that I believe is very critical that we keep in mind. While globally, and particularly in the global north, we know that we are picking up and we have shortage of labor. At the macro global level, the situation is not that rosy. Not only we see that gap between the low income and the emerging economy on one hand, where they are still struggling to recover from COVID-19. And at the beginning of 2022, that recovery was also going well for low-income country and emerging economy. But the impact of the multiple crises, starting with the war in Ukraine and later on the inflation and all that we are going on, has just wiped out all those initial recovery from the low-income country and the emerging economy. Another thing that is interesting, our data showing, yes, you're right, if you compare third quarter 2022 to last quarter 2019, we still are short of 1.5% of working hours that we have lost, which is equivalent of 40 million jobs. Our projection for 2023 is a global increase, a global growth of employment by 1%, which is quite very low. And interesting enough, you also have the combining effect in Africa and the Middle East. We could pick up to 3% in terms of employment growth. However, when you take into account the population growth and the youth bulge, and therefore the net effect remain in that 1 or even below 1%. Critical point, and yesterday there have been some session on reskillings. What we're also noticing is the big gap between the low-skilled jobs and the high-end skilled job, which is also quite very, very crucial. We also have to keep in mind that we have 2 billion, and that's still in the informal sector. And between 2005, 2004, 2019, globally, the informal economy has gone down by 5%, which means that we have started formalizing that informal sector. But since COVID, the recovery that we're talking about, particularly again from the emerging economy, that recovery is happening more on the informal sector. So, which raised the issue of the risk that those low-paid jobs or low-skill jobs are facing in this informal sector with lack of basic social protection and so forth. Maybe one last point I don't want to monopolize too much of the time is, which is a very worry for ILO, while we project that the unemployment will raise up by 3 million from 205 million to 208 million total unemployed people in next year globally. We know that you'll have countries, basically mostly in the north, where we'll have where the labor market will heat up. And because the shortage that we are which raised for us the issue of the mobility of the workforce from one country to another or from one region to another. Finally, is what we call, by lack of better term, the working pools. In 2023, we estimate that 214 million workers with a regular 40 hours work a week will still be unable to have $1.90 a day on that. So while they are working full-time, they still will be struggling to pay their basic needs. The silver lining is, and I'll stop. The silver lining, of course, and I hope we'll touch on that in the whole digital economy and the service-oriented economy that we know is going to pick up, giving opportunity to the youth.
Thank you very much for that. Secretary Walsh, let's come to you here, because the situation in America, it seems, is very different. You've got a very tight labour market. You've got millions of Americans who feel comfortable about walking away from their jobs at the moment. And yet you've got a government that's just about to inject $360 billion into the economy, in part to speed along the green transition, creating a lot of new jobs, careers, opportunities. One, is there a problem with the nature of work in America that so many people feel they've lost purpose or dissatisfaction, or they have dissatisfaction with the level of compensation? And how do you fix that? And two, where on earth are you going to get all these workers from for the new green transition jobs?
No, thank you. Thank you, and thank everyone for being here this morning as well. I think that just to kind of piggyback on the previous question, just part of it, the workplace is going to be very different, and I don't think it's going back to what it was pre-pandemic. Whether the work site, the idea of work, and how we move forward here. I spent time as mayor of Boston for 7 years. I did a lot of recruiting companies into the city of Boston. Worked with colleges, universities. Built on our workforce development programs to create pathways into tech jobs that for people that didn't have necessary college degrees, and understanding that equity needs to be at the front and center of this. Become the Secretary of Labor, 10.5 million people out of work, getting people back to work. So to answer your question, I think there's a couple things. Right now in America, the unemployment rate is 3.5%. The labor participation rate is roughly 63%. It's not quite where we need it to be. We need to get that number up. And we also need to, we have lots of folks in America that working in mediocre jobs, meaning they're paid mediocre and they feel mediocre pay. They're not quite in the middle class. They want to get in the middle class. So the future is this. I think there are a couple things. Number one is we're doubling down on apprenticeships. We're doubling down on workforce development, job training. We need to make sure the systems that are in place are actually going out and recruiting people into industry in America, new industries, making sure, or even existing industries, making sure that we're working with governors and mayors and local governments. We have to do that. And at the end of the day, when you go through a job training program, there needs to be a job there. That's why we're looking more at the apprentice model. When I leave here today, I'm going to Austria to meet with some companies to talk about the apprentice program in Austria. I know that here in Switzerland there's apprentice programs. They're set up differently than what we have in the United States of America. In America, we think of apprenticeships as the building trades, and I come out of the building trades, and it's a great pathway. So we're going to really looking at apprenticeships. We're working with large corporations in America to think about, you need to think about apprenticeships. So I think that that's a way in. That creates an opportunity for people that might be in a low-skill, low-wage job today that have an opportunity to get into one of these green jobs that should be paying well. So there is that opportunity. There are people out there, as we said backstage, there are people out there, we just don't know where they are. And I can't quite, I don't have the fancy lingo to say, well, this is why they're not coming back to work, because they still have a trust fund. These folks don't have trust funds. And I think a lot of these folks, you mentioned, I'm taking words out of your mouth now, some millennials might not be coming back to work, but we do have to, I think that what President Biden is focused on, creating an economy that works the middle class, the bottom up and the middle class out, really, we have to do a better job. And when I say we, myself, the administration, the elected officials, of letting people know what that really means. Because I think people see, the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS bill, they hear all that, but they really have no idea what that is. And they don't equate that that's actually a job. And we have to make that connection there. So I think that's one of the things we have to do. And then also America has, this is your headline, America has to really, we need immigration reform in America. America has been a country that's always depended on immigrants. Right now we don't have a good immigration policy. And I'm not talking about the southern border down by Texas. I'm talking about immigration policy. I'm talking about students that come from countries around the globe and go to America to get educated, to my city and other cities. And if they're not fortunate enough to get a visa, they get sent back. So we really need to look at immigration reform. And unfortunately, in a lot of countries in the world, immigration has become one of those hot button issues, and it really shouldn't be.
Is that going to happen now that you've lost the House?
I don't know. There was a lot of. I think that a lot of businesses, every business I talk to in America, big business, when I bring up immigration, they're all for it. And I said, you need to start this conversation. You need to have these conversations because, I think that the threat to the American economy, long term, is not inflation. It's immigration. It's not having enough workers, as you said. I mean, all these jobs are being created, and forget the jobs being created. There are jobs available right now in the United States of America that we don't have enough people for. So it really is about reskilling. I'm going to talk about we talked about the reskilling revolution yesterday. Doing that in America, upskilling and reskilling is something that's really key in America, but around the globe as well.
Pamela, the situation that you're working with, I think, is very different. And as I mentioned in the introduction, there has been long-term scarring, it seems, in low-income countries, particularly as we see value chains reshaped here. How do those jobs get brought back? Does this have to be external support, or is there something that can be done domestically in terms of self-help to generate that employment and that opportunity?
Thanks, Amar. I think that there are a couple of things that can be done. The first is, for example, I was just in the breakfast this morning on the African Continental Free Trade Area, and the potential that lies within that free trade area for increased jobs, increased development, increased economic prosperity, the whole shebang. What is going to be important to support that is specifically what the Secretary General of ILO, as well as Marty, Secretary of Labor, talked about. It is making the kinds of investments in new technologies, in digital upskilling, in sustainable green growth. Because what we've found is that, one, the green growth issue is great. Everybody's all for it. But it's a double-edged sword. It's a double-edged sword because while we are building a whole new generation of vehicles, electric vehicles, and so on, we're pulling it from a continent and a country that is in serious trouble in terms of $1.90, if that much, per day for work. You're looking at DRC, 70% of the cobalt comes from one country, and we look at the situation there and we ask, well, how does this balance? So how do we re-establish a kind of, or I shouldn't say re-establish, how do we actually establish equity in this green transition? How do we ensure that those countries, those developing countries, are not left behind or put in a worse position? Secondly, there's a due diligence legislation that's coming out of Europe. That's talking about, making sure that along the value chain they can account for their decarbonization efforts, their certification. Who's going to do that? How? These are critical issues because already we've seen in 2020 over 4,000 farmers were decertified from exporting cocoa from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. Over 4,000. And that's just the beginning. So there has to be a way also to ensure that that green growth, that green transition does not make it worse post-pandemic for these countries. The other issue is the digital divide. The digital divide, digitalization has changed completely how the working world looks. And we've seen that in the pandemic. In 2 years, we've leaped 10. So while that has been great, and it's allowed for, e-commerce to thrive, and it's allowed for people to work from home. And there are 35% of the developing world connected, 35%. And in Africa, it's 18%. So if we're going to talk about a digital world and digital explosion, we also have to ensure that the connectivity is actually there. Because we can't talk about a digital growth and digital explosion if there's no connectivity. So that's another area that's going to be critical in terms of investment. On the issue of servicification, Marty, you talked about that. The fact that services is now basically thriving and moving more than manufacturing. Servicification of the jobs is also going to change in terms of immigration. And how does immigration work in tandem with the servicification of those jobs. How do we move forward on that? I think these are the kinds of elements that are going to be important. There's more what we call onshoring, reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, the various new names that come about post-pandemic. But the point is that more and more countries are beginning to look closer in. And how is that going to affect jobs? How is that going to affect workers? And how is that going to enable these workers to become part of shorter value chains that are closer to them? So I'll stop there, but I think these are the clear elements that need to be looked at: the digital, the green growth, sustainability issues, and also inclusivity.